The truth is, if you build on small successes, the large successes will just naturally come. Why? Because success breeds success. On the other hand, failure breeds failure. Some of you have been pushed so far down, you lack all confidence to do anything. This is your mantra. I never have anything good happen to me. That's the mantra you live by. That's your whole life. It sums it up. Let me tell you why. Last week I began a new series entitled The 10 Characteristics of a Giant Killer. And of course it's based on the story of David and Goliath. Now I'm sure that most of you are very familiar with this story, especially if you went to church as a child. But even if you didn't attend church, I'm sure you've heard of it. But I doubt very seriously that any of you really learned anything that you could apply to your life. And that's sad because there is so much that we can glean and learn from this story. You see, we'll probably never face a true giant like Goliath, but we all will face giant problems. And those giant problems can be defeated in the very same way that David defeated Goliath. So in this series, what we want to do is we want to discover what made David such a great giant killer, and then we want to apply that to our life. So this morning is part 2 of our series, The 10 Characteristics of a Giant Killer. Now last week we covered the first 3 characteristics, so this morning we're going to cover 3 more. Here's characteristic number 4 for those of you taking notes. Giant killers are not overwhelmed by the challenge. You see, when everyone else was overwhelmed by Goliath's challenge, David wasn't. Turn with me, if you would, to the book of 1 Samuel chapter 17. And yes, we're going to stay in this chapter all sermon long. But turn to 1 Samuel chapter 17, verses 4 through 11, and I'll show you what I'm talking about. Then Goliath, a Philistine champion from Gath, came out of the Philistine ranks to face the forces of Israel. He was over 9 feet tall. He wore a bronze helmet, and his bronze coat of mail weighed 125 pounds. He also wore bronze leg armor, and he carried a bronze javelin on his shoulder. The shaft of his spear was as heavy and thick as a weaver's beam, tipped with an iron spearhead that weighed 15 pounds. Now, if you ever had to swing a 3-pound hammer, you can have appreciation for that tip. His armor bearer walked ahead of him carrying a shield. Goliath stood and shouted a taunt across to the Israelites. "Why are you all coming out to fight?" he called. "I am the Philistine champion, but you are only the servants of Saul. Choose one man to come down here and fight me. If he kills me, then we will be your slaves. But if I kill him, you will be our slaves. I defy the armies of Israel today. Send me a man who will fight me." When Saul and the Israelites heard this, they were terrified and deeply shaken. And everyone, in other words, everyone who saw and heard was overwhelmed with fear. They were overwhelmed with Goliath's great size. They were overwhelmed with the size of his armor and his weapons. They were overwhelmed by his challenge to come out and fight him. But David was the only one that was not overwhelmed. In fact, he was the only one who was not terrified and deeply shaken. Instead, he wanted to know what would happen to the man who killed Goliath. Look at verse 26. Then David spoke to the men who were standing by him, saying, "What will be done for the man who kills this Philistine and takes away the reproach from Israel? For who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should taunt the armies of the living God?" So as you can see, when all the others were overwhelmed with fear, David wasn't. Now, I keep using the word overwhelmed, but I want to make sure that everyone knows what I mean by that. So let me explain the etymology of the word overwhelmed. It was coined in the 14th century. And as you might have guessed, overwhelmed is a compound word. That simply means that it's made up of more than one word. In this case, it's made up of 2 words. The word over and the Middle English word whelmen, which means to turn upside down. Now, originally, this was a seafaring term that only sailors used. And they used it to refer to a ship that had been turned upside down as a result of a wave rolling over it. So if a ship was sunk in a storm, they would say that it must have been overwhelmed, meaning that a wave must have rolled over it and turned it upside down, causing it to sink. Now, in the 16th century, people started using this word as a figure of speech to describe the feelings of a person when they're hit by an emotional situation or circumstance that makes them feel like their world is being turned upside down. Now, let me give you two examples of how we use this word today. One's a positive example and the other is negative. Let's suppose that you buy a lottery ticket and you find out that you just won $300 million. Obviously, you would be filled with excitement, joy, and unbelief. You would probably say something like this with your voice going high. Oh my God, I can't believe I won that. I've never won anything, and I just won $300 million. But as those emotions come over you, you would also feel like your world was just turned upside down, but in a good way. And when someone asked you how you feel, maybe you would be interviewed by the news station. You would probably say, I'm just overwhelmed. In other words, your life has just been turned upside down, and you're kind of disoriented because you've never had that much money before, and you never thought you would ever have that much money. So it's in a good way that your life has been turned upside down. On the other hand, let's suppose that you just found out that you have cancer. And at that very moment, you're filled with fear, dread, and probably 1,000 questions. What's my chances of survival? How bad will the chemo be? Will I need to have surgery? Etc. But as those emotions and those feelings flood over you, you would also feel like your world was being turned upside down. And you would probably be in shock and not know what to do. You would be overwhelmed by the news and the emotions associated with it. And that's exactly how the Israelites felt when Goliath walked out and he challenged them to choose a man to come out and fight him. And this was a fight to the death. Now picture this. Goliath was 9 feet tall. Anyone stood next to someone who was 7 foot? Maybe Joe Hass, that played at Northeastern State and the coach over here at the high school. How many of you ever stood next to him? 7 feet tall, and you're thinking, what a giant. But imagine this. Goliath was 2 feet taller than him. He was 9 feet. His breastplate weighed 125 pounds. The shaft of his spear was as thick as a branch. And I'm not talking about a little branch. I'm talking about a branch about the size of your wrist. And the tip of his spear weighed 15 pounds. And he probably wore a size 32 shoe. Now, I guarantee you, all of the Israelites were filled with terror, dread, and a feeling of hopelessness. They were truly overwhelmed by that fear and dread and hopelessness. They felt like their world was being turned upside down because they were danged if they did and danged if they didn't. And they didn't know what to do but just stand there like a lump on a log. But my point is this. When everyone else was overwhelmed by Goliath, David wasn't. Instead of being paralyzed by fear, he wanted to know what the reward would be for the man who killed this Philistine who would dare taunt the armies of the living God. Man, you got to love David. But it also makes me wonder why David wasn't overwhelmed when everyone else was. Well, here's what I've noticed over the years. I've noticed that most people get overwhelmed whenever a giant begins threatening them. In other words, when they're threatened by a giant problem. Look back at verses 8 through 11. Goliath stood and shouted a taunt across to the Israelites. "Why are you all coming out to fight?" he called. "I am the Philistine champion, but you are only the servants of Saul. Choose one man to come down here and fight me. If he kills me, then we will be your slaves. But if I kill him, you will be our slaves. I defy the armies of Israel today. Send me a man who will fight me." When Saul and the Israelites heard this, they were terrified and deeply shaken. Now again, why wasn't David overwhelmed with fear when everyone else was? Well, I'll tell you why. It was because of his faith. You see, the whole point of the story is that David believed that God would enable him to defeat any giant that came his way. Now remember, we might not have to face a real giant, but we do have to face giant problems. And those giant problems can be defeated in the very same way that David defeated Goliath. So we have to believe the way that David believed. We have to believe that God will enable us to overcome any giant problem that comes our way. But I've also noted that people tend to get overwhelmed when a problem never seems to go away. In other words, there's never any relief from it. It's always there. Turn to 1 Samuel chapter 17, verse 16. This might be a little detail that some of you have missed. Notice what it says. For 40 days, every morning and evening. So twice a day, for 40 days, the Philistine champion strutted in front of the Israelite army. So every day for 40 days, Goliath strutted out and he challenged the Israelites to send out one man to fight him. And every day he did that, the Israelites became more frightened until they became paralyzed with fear. But not David. The first day he heard Goliath's challenge, he stepped up to the plate. And he was willing to fight Goliath, and there's a great lesson in this for us. You see, most problems are not going to go away on their own. And the longer we wait to deal with them, the worse they will become. So we cannot procrastinate, because that only makes things worse. So we have to step up, and we have to face the problem and deal with it as soon as possible. You see, the more you keep talking about the problem without actually doing anything about it, the worse it's going to become, especially in your mind. The first day that Goliath strutted out in front of the armies of Israel and he challenged them, let me tell you, it was terrifying. They were all frightened. But each day he did it was worse than the previous day. So by the 40th day, the whole Israelite army was paralyzed with fear. People, don't allow that to happen with you. When a problem arises, analyze it, seek God about it through word, through prayer, and through counsel, and then do something about it. Because if you don't, it's only going to get worse, especially in your mind. Sometimes we blow a problem up that's really not that big into something that is huge. But the reason we do is because every day we're faced with that problem and it doesn't go away. It begins to paralyze us a little bit more until finally we're paralyzed and we can't move at all. Now, let me give you the three main reasons David wasn't afraid of Goliath when everyone else was. Number one, he had a passion to protect God's honor. You see, David became indignant over the way that God was being mocked by Goliath, and that angered him. And that anger spurred him to action. Now, the truth is, some of you need to get angry because the problems you are facing are counterproductive to the promises of God. And to protect God's honor, you need to do something about it. In other words, you need to get your house in order. And you need to get your finances in order. Because if you say that you're a Christian and it doesn't show, that's mocking God. Let me say something to you, and I'm not trying to put any condemnation on you, but if you've been a Christian for over 10 years, and your marriage is horrible, you don't have a relationship with your children, your finances are a wreck, I want you to understand something. The promises of God are being mocked, because Jesus said that He has come that we might have eternal life and that we might have life more abundant. Now that word more abundant, or that word abundant, means better, not only in length, but in quality. Jesus came that we might have a better quality of life. And when you tell people you're a Christian, they expect you to have your life in order. I'm not saying that every area of your life needs to be in order, but the major thing should be. You should have a good marriage. And if you don't know how to have a good marriage, then get some help. If you don't have a relationship with your children, go order all of my past DVD series on how to build a relationship with your children and how to parent. If your finances are a wreck, go get help. Because I want you to understand something. Those giant problems in your life are mocking the promises of God. And you should be indignant about that. So, for the sake of God's honor, take care of the problems in your home. I do not understand Christians that will live with a problem rather than fix it. And I should hear a amen. Number two, David had a desire for the reward. Never underestimate the power of an incentive. People will risk their life if the reward is great enough. And last but not least, David had confidence in God and in himself. Now listen to me. Confidence in God but not in yourself makes you a wonderful person of prayer who never does anything. Those type of people want God to fight all of their battles, and listen to me, God won't. In fact, James said it best when he said, faith without works is dead. So God is going to make you do your part. If all you do is pray about the problem, I can assure you that problem will never go away, because God always makes us do something. He always makes us do our part. In fact, let me use Jesus as an example. When you go back and you study all of the healings that Jesus performed, it's kind of interesting because he always made someone do something. The man with the withered hand, what did he tell the man to do? Stretch forth your hand. Well, if he could stretch forth his hand, it wouldn't have been withered. What it literally means in the Greek is to stretch out his fingers. It doesn't mean to go. No, his hand was withered and he couldn't use it. He said, stretch forth your hand. What did he mean? He meant stretch out your fingers. Well, if the man could have done that, his hand wouldn't have been withered. With the man that was crippled, he said, take up your bed and walk. Well, if the man could have taken up his bed and walked, he wouldn't have needed to be healed because he was crippled. But Jesus always made them do something. Do you remember the 10 lepers? He said, go show yourself unto the priest. And then it says, why they were going to the priest, they were healed. It's interesting. Jesus could have healed them right there, but Jesus always made them do something. He always made them step out in faith. Let me explain something. This is the way God works. He'll do his part, but you must always do your part. There's always something that you have to do in order to step out in faith. And when you step out in faith to do that, that's when God shows up. And you need to realize that. David had learned that. When the bear came, and we're going to look at that in just a minute, I don't want to get ahead of myself. He knew that if he stepped out, even though he was fearful, God would enable him. When the lion came, he knew that if he did his part, God would enable him. When Goliath came, this is a giant problem. God's always been there. Guess what? I know that if I step out and do my part, God's going to enable me. Characteristic number 5. Giant killers build on past successes. You see, David's confidence, or should we say David's faith, was built on past successes. Look at verses 34 through 36, and I'll show you what I'm talking about. But David said to Saul, your servant was tending his father's sheep. Yes, I'm just a shepherd. When a lion or a bear came and took a lamb from the flock, I went out after him and attacked him and rescued it from his mouth. And when he rose up against me, I seized him by his beard and struck him and killed him. Your servant has killed both the lion and the bear. And this uncircumcised Philistine will be like one of them, since he has taunted the armies of the living God. The truth is, if you build on small successes, the large successes will just naturally come. Why? Because success breeds success. On the other hand, failure breeds failure. Some of you have been pushed so far down. You lack all confidence to do anything. This is your mantra. I never have anything good happen to me. That's the mantra you live by. That's your whole life. It sums it up. Let me tell you why. Because you've had one failure after another. Let me tell you what you have to do. You have to choose one area and make that become a success in your life, and then you choose another, and then another, and then another. Because success breeds success. The reason that we continually succeed as a church is because we build on our successes. Our staff refers to it as momentum. We continually work on something until it becomes successful, and then we move to the next project. If we fail, we look to see how we can turn that failure into a success. And most of the time, we can turn that failure into a success. Now, to be honest with you, sometimes the only way that we can turn a failure into a success is by making it a learning experience. In other words, we were successful in learning how not to do something. Let me give you a personal example. How many of you invest in stock? How many of you do options or something like that? Well, let me just be honest with you. I've lost a lot of money in investments. But trust me, I've learned some valuable lessons on not what to do. And so I choose to think of those as successes, because it was a success when I learned, don't do that. But I want you to understand something. Success breeds success. And everything we do here at Cornerstone Fellowship is part of the building process for future success. And we're going to continue to be successful. We've done some wonderful things here, and I'm telling you, we're going to do some more wonderful things. In fact, it's only going to get better. 2016, our staff got together, and we looked at all the outreaches and events that we wanted to do, and let me tell you, we'll probably do as much as twice what we did this year. You don't know this, and we're going to celebrate it, and I'm probably letting the cat out of the bag. We finished a Kenyan program of Water Missions International. We went into about 4 different communities, and we were able to bring them clean water because of what you gave. Lives were saved, but more importantly, they bring ministers in, and they're preparing them to receive the gospel, and then they present the gospel, and thousands have gotten saved in Kenya because of what we have done. And that's just one of the successes that we've had this year. We'll actually do kind of a summary of it. I think we're doing it in our Christmas service. But I want you to understand something. We're getting ready to unveil something in February that's going to blow your mind. And as we begin to do these things, I look at how God is going to use our church for success. But you don't start where we're at. I've had more people come to me that are planting churches, and they'll say, you did something that most people won't do. You planted a church in a small town. Let me tell you, if you want to be successful, you plant a church in a large city. Because you have all of these people, this great population that you can bring in, and you can target certain people or certain different groups of people. When you go in a small town, you got to be able to minister from all the way from the children to people who are 90 years old. The greatest struggle we've had is trying to please everyone with music. And you know what we've learned? You can't do it. But we're pretty successful at what we do. And we're going to be even more successful because success breeds success. Characteristic number 6. Giant killers convince others that they will be successful. Look at verse number 37. And David said, the Lord who delivered me from the paw of the lion and from the paw of the bear, he will deliver me from the hand of this Philistine. And Saul said to David, go, and may the Lord be with you. I hope you see this, because only when David told Saul about his past successes, that was the only thing that caused Saul to say, go, I'll allow you to do this. You see, up until this time, Saul was not going to allow David to go fight Goliath. In fact, if you remember, when he was finally brought before Saul, all they heard was this young man. When he heard young man, he was thinking 20 to 25. This young man is willing to go fight Goliath, and they brought him to Saul, and Saul was probably expecting to see someone in his prime, about 23 years old, to step into his tent and have all these rippling muscles, and they bring a 14-year-old boy with his voice probably still crackling because he's going through puberty. And he says, don't be ridiculous. But then David does something. He starts recounting his past successes. And then Saul said to David, go, and may the Lord be with you. Up until that time, Saul said, no way. But self-confidence brings a conviction, and it makes others believe in you. Confidence in God also carries a conviction, and it makes others believe in God. Listen to me. I've seen God do mighty things in my personal life. I've seen God do mighty things in my family. I've seen God do mighty things in this church. I've seen God do mighty things in other people's lives. And I'm convinced that God will show up big time whenever I have a need. And that confidence makes my kids believe in God. It's kind of interesting, and I'll kind of go off on a tangent on this if you don't mind. But when my girls were little, we would talk about how big God was. And then we would share with them what God has done in our life. My wife was diagnosed with a pituitary gland tumor. One doctor told me, didn't even tell her. She's done. She won't live. This is back in a time when they didn't do what they do today. They had to go up through her sinuses, and they took out half of her pituitary gland and that tumor there, and they said she's going to have hormone problems all of her life. Never had a problem. Never had a problem. Really scared her. We went to prayer with God, anointed her with oil, brought people in who prayed with her, and we stood on the promises of God. And doctors started coming into her room, and one of the reasons they started coming into her room, because she was in the hospital for quite a while, because back then it was a major surgery. And the reason they were coming in is because they wanted to see this miraculous patient. He wasn't having any hormone problems. And Lisa was scared. She said, why are all these different doctors coming? I said, honey, they want to see the miracle of God. Our girls grew up seeing God do mighty things. And so when they were in high school and in college, they would call and say, Mom and Dad, we really need you to pray for this. And they believed that God was going to move in a mighty way. But what they really believed in was the God of Alan and Lisa. And now Macy is 27 years old and Mike is 30, and they're still calling us, and we want them to call us. But here's what I've told them. You need to understand something about God. When Isaac was born and was the son of promise, he grew up hearing about the God of Abraham. He grew up hearing the promises of God that God had made to Abraham. He was actually part of the promise when he carried that load up to Mount Moriah, laid it down, and Abraham was just about to slaughter him, but he provided. Of course, we know the story of Ram. Isaac grew up hearing about the God of Abraham, but it wasn't until he faced a giant problem and he needed God, and God became his God, and then he became known as the God of Abraham and Isaac. Jacob grew up hearing these stories of what God had done for Abraham and what God had done for his father. And then it's kind of interesting about this because it really wasn't his God until he experienced a giant problem. And when he experienced that giant problem, then all of a sudden the God of Abraham and Isaac became his God. And from that point on, he was known as the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And here's what we told our girls. God is our God. And you better believe he shows up big time when we need him. But you need to understand something. At this point in your life, it's time that he became your God. So that he's not just the God of my mom and dad. He's the God of my mom and dad and me. And that's the way we have to train our children. Let me tell you, confidence brings with it a conviction. And confidence in God brings a conviction and makes others believe in God. But then we have to pass that off where that conviction becomes theirs. The bottom line is this. You have to convince yourself that you can succeed before you can convince others that you will be successful. The truth is, confidence is contagious. But sometimes, sad to say, it's not contagious enough. And in those cases, you've got to leave everyone behind and go out and succeed on your own. Our first Halloween carnival was a good example of that. I was praying, God, how do we reach our community? And you need to understand at that time, we didn't bring in much money. We were down in the National Guard Armory. We were only in the small part of the armory. The big part wasn't even started, really. We had just put up 2 walls is all that we had done. And I'm praying to God, and God said, do a Halloween carnival. And so I started praying about it, started mind mapping, came up with this, went to God, said, God, this is what you want me to do? He said, yeah, this would be wonderful. Do that. And so I told Lisa about it, and I'll be honest with you. Lisa didn't believe it would be successful. Told her people, church, this is what we're going to do. And you need to understand at the time, we didn't have 100 people coming to church. And let me tell you, at that time, we counted every man, woman, and child. And if they brought their pet or it was in the car, we counted them. Even my wife did not believe that the Halloween carnival would work. So I had to step out and basically do it on my own. Now, that's not to say that people didn't help me. They did. But they did it out of love for me, not out of confidence that it would work. In fact, I think most of them were chipping in because they just so loved me. But I know inside what they were thinking, because even my wife admitted this afterwards. So, oh, God, his heart's going to be broken when 50 people show up. And let me tell you, when we opened those doors, there were 300 people waiting to get inside. And from that point on, they continually streamed in, and we had people out there counting them. We conservatively estimate that over 1,200 people came that night. We counted about 1,800, but we subtracted 600 because we figured that's probably how many went out and came back in. So we know for a fact that more than 1,200 people came in. When we got to the end part of it, we invited everyone to come in to see a drama, and over 300 people raised their hands to receive Jesus Christ. Our people were overwhelmed, but more importantly, they were shocked. At that point, I realized how many people didn't believe, because everyone started coming and said, Pastor Allen, we just thought you were an idiot. But bless your heart, we wanted to support you. Let me tell you, sometimes people don't believe in you. But if it's a God idea or God's laid it on your heart or you know you're supposed to do it, sometimes you have to step out and do it alone. Now, here's what I want you to do. I want you to pull out your discipleship card. Everyone got their discipleship card? Whenever you hear a sermon or you're reading through the Bible, you need to ask yourself 3 questions. Is there a command I should obey? An example I should follow? Or a principle I should live by? Now, in this, there's an example you should follow. What's that example? Or whose example? David's example. We want to follow David's example. So whenever you have a giant problem, here's what you need to do. You need to ask, what did David do that I'm not doing? You know, if I were you and I had a giant problem, here's what I would do. After I finish this series, I would buy all 3, even though you can watch them online. And I would put that DVD in, and I would go through everything that David did, and then I would ask concerning your problem, what did David do that I'm not doing? Did he act when I'm paralyzed by fear? Did he want to protect God's honor, and I really don't care about God's honor? What did he do that I'm not doing? That's what you have to ask yourself. Because the truth of the matter is, you can have success just like David did if you do what he did. There's a wonderful verse, and I love this verse. It says that God is no respecter of persons. I've stood on that verse. Because as I read through the Bible and I see all these people who have done great things for God, and then I hear about all these other stories and testimonies of great things that people have done for God, I come to God and I say, you know, God, I might not have the same gifts, talents, or abilities, so maybe I can't do the very same things that they did, but God, you have given every one of us gifts, talents, and abilities. You know my gifts, talents, and abilities. What can I do for you? Because God is no respecter of persons. Now let's apply this to the story. I want you to understand something. David was only 14 years old, and I think the reason he was only 14 years old, the reason he was so young, the reason his muscles hadn't developed, he hadn't even probably reached the height that he did as a man, was because everyone would have looked at him if he was 23 years old and they would go, oh yeah, he can do it. And then when he would have won, everyone would have said, my gosh, what a great warrior he is, which they did anyway. But when you're 14 years old, let me tell you, you have to believe that God was in the story. And God is no respecter of persons. You might think that you can't succeed, but I promise you, you're greater than this 14-year-old boy. If you'll have the faith that he had, if you'll put your confidence in him, if you'll build on past successes, if you'll step out and do your part, God will do his part. Now, let me tell you this. We all had, and some of you still have, one big giant problem. And that big giant problem is that we're sinners and God is just. And because God is just, he must punish sin. And he must reward righteousness. The problem is none of us are righteous. And this is a huge problem because God is just. Therefore, he cannot allow us to go into heaven without our sins being paid for. And if we pay for our own sins, then I want you to understand, even when we do that, we're still not righteous, so God couldn't raise us from the dead. So God did his part. God sent his son Jesus to die for your sin and to pay the penalty for your sin. But here's what I told you. God always makes us do our part. And even though God has done the hard part, the big part, you still have a part to play. You have to make Jesus Christ your personal Lord and Savior. You have to put your trust in Jesus that he paid for your sin, and you have to make him Lord of your life. If you don't do that, it doesn't matter that God did his part. Just like your problems. God is ready to do his part if you'll do your part. But here, if you don't do your part, if you don't make Jesus Lord, if you don't put your trust in him, I want you to understand this one big, giant problem will follow you through eternity. And you'll never get to go to heaven because of that giant problem. But we can take care of it this morning. All you have to do is realize that God has done his part. He sent Jesus to die for your sin, to pay the penalty. Now what you have to do is your part. You have to step out in faith and say, Jesus, I put my trust in you, and I want you to be Lord of my life. And when you do that, your problem is gone. You now get to go to heaven